started. You two ready?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Great. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this Friday Fun Day session from the National Constitution Center. My name is Carrie Sautner. I'm the Chief Learning Officer at the center, and I'm so excited to have you all join us today. Today's session is all about voting rights. And the fun part about Fridays, guests. Now, our weekly VIP special guest who will be running this dialogue is Jeff Rosen, the CEO and president of the National Constitution Center. But we also have an extra special guest today. Jamelle Bouie will be joining us to talk about voting rights, amendments, and all the different questions that you have and you're already putting in the chat. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to get us rolling. And please, students, all the questions you want to ask, let us know.
Thank you so much, Curry, and welcome, Jamelle Bouie. It is such an honor to talk to you, and I am such an admirer of your wonderful columns for the New York Times, which are so striking in their constitutional rigor and depth. In so many cases, your pieces ask what lessons we can draw from constitutional history to cast light on current questions. And I always learn so much from your scholarship and insight. I want to begin by asking you, you were a distinguished journalist, formerly chief political correspondent at Slate. You went to the University of Virginia. How did you become so interested in American history and the Constitution in particular?
First of all, thank you for having me. I know I think I did this last year, the year before, and it was a lot of fun. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. I've always been interested in American history since I was a kid. I have no real explanation for that. It might just be kind of a side effect of growing up in Virginia, right? Like, down the street from Jamestown, down the street from sort of these landmark places in American history. But I've always had an interest, but it didn't really become a serious interest actually until after college. In college, I studied political theory and political science. So history is obviously involved in that, but that wasn't necessarily the focus of my studies. But it was after college, while I was working as a journalist, that I really kind of delved into history and got involved and started thinking more seriously about American history for a variety of reasons. My own interest, events in the world that I think demanded a better understanding of American history to kind of put them in a proper context, both for myself and for readers. And the way my brain works, I suppose, is that once I start kind of pulling on a thread, I just continue following it. And so it just so happened that over the years, what began with, say, a deep dive into Civil War and Reconstruction kind of ended up in the early Republic era and the founding era, and then from there, and I'm sort of still in the midst of it. Really, a really serious study of that era, of the history that's been written about that era, which is very broad and very deep, and of my own kind of engagement with those issues.
Well, you're making a remarkable contribution, and you are bringing to a very broad audience the scholarship of traditional historians like Pauline Maier, and also calling our attention to philosophers and scholars who some of us were less familiar with in your pieces. What I thought would be interesting, just to introduce our friends in the audience to your work, is to just ask you about some of your most recent columns, because all of them are just full of constitutional arguments. And the most recent one that I have, Madison saw something in the Constitution we should open our eyes to, talks about partisan gerrymandering in North Carolina and reminds us of a clause that many have forgotten, namely the Republican form of government clause, and said that might have something to say about partisan gerrymandering. Tell our friends about your argument in that piece.
Sure. So I've been a little bit obsessed with that clause in the Constitution for a while, because from my reading, from my sort of, I feel like, advanced lay reading, maybe, it is it feels weirdly consequential, right? Like a clause that states that the United States shall guarantee to ever sit a Republican form of government. on one hand, it feels sort of a little throwaway, just sort of something that's being put in there. And if you read the debates over this clause during ratification, there is real argument about what exactly this even meant. Some saying it was kind of a throwaway clause, others saying it's sort of this profound guarantee of our liberty, so on and so forth. But it seems to me to just hold a lot of potential, especially if sort of understood broadly, because it raises the question: what does it mean for a state to have a Republican form of government, and what would it mean to encroach on a Republican form of government? And you can kind of take that in different directions. And for as much as it practically is something of a constitutional dead letter, it's not. There's not too much jurisprudence around it. There's a lot of legal scholars have certainly written about it over the years, and have had their own spins on how you could use it. But as far as the courts are concerned, it's sort of been left to lie. But I think it's a fascinating clause of the Constitution. It carries, I think, some pretty profound implications if you want to take it seriously, and sort of in this mindset of thinking broadly about American democracy, thinking sort of expansively about the Constitution. What could you use this clause for? What did this clause imply that could be put to the task of sort of like shoring up and expanding American democracy? And so that's a column, a thing I cut from the column actually, that I think I'm going to explore later, is going back to Madison, who I quote by way of Federalist number 43. One of Madison's big concerns and fears, both during the period of the Articles of Confederation and then sort of during the writing of the Constitution, after writing the Constitution, was this idea that the threat to republicanism came from the states, that it was the states where like factions can take hold. It's the states where factions can act in ways that are sort of deleterious to the people in really dramatic ways, and it is sort of that kind of action within the states that can kind of bubble up and begin to undermine the national government as well. And so for Madison, he would, throughout the Constitutional Convention, he is not single-mindedly, but sort of consistently saying we should have some way for the national government to basically veto state laws, to kind of prevent, kind of put a thumb on the state laws to make sure they don't go too far. And for him, he's thinking, policies to print paper money, to relieve debt. I mean, he's thinking very much in terms of material terms, but I think the insight that the states, by virtue of being smaller polities, are more vulnerable to the spirits of faction is probably a correct insight, and is worth sort of exploring in our current context. So that's sort of in my head part of the argument in that column that I'm gonna kind of expand on later.
Well, I think you're on to a very important area of constitutional argument. And I remember from my readings years ago that, as you say, Madison is centrally focused on the concern of the threat by the states and the desire that state governments not be able to reinstitute forms of monarchy or aristocracy. And then during the Civil War, especially during the ratification debates over the Reconstruction Amendments, people invoked the Republican form of government clause to say you can't have a minority of voters controlling a majority of votes in a state. Basically, you've got to have majority rule. And just let's play that out for a moment. I remember that Robert Bork had said that the Republican form of government clause might be a better location for a lot of voting rights jurisprudence than the 14th Amendment. You suggest that extreme partisan gerrymandering, where a minority of voters can control a majority of representatives, might violate the Republican form of government clause. What are other forms of voting arrangements that you think might be challenged under the Republican form of government clause?
Now, beyond extreme partisan gerrymandering, I think it kind of depends on how expansive you want to go, right? So you could make a case, right, that our current method of even arranging sort of political boundaries, sort of first past the post, single member districts, because it kind of effectively disenfranchises huge numbers of people, could itself constitute a violation of the guarantee clause. Now, it's sort of because those have always existed in the United States. It's sort of hard. I think it's like a little tricky to make that argument, but if you can be creative, you can make that argument. And you can kind of make use the clause, I think, broadly, in furtherance of reforms that would kind of bring the American political system closer to the ideal of one person, one vote.
Absolutely. And it's such a fertile area of argument for just the reasons you say. That relates to two important columns that you wrote recently as well. The Constitution was made for us, not the other way around, in that you argue that fundamental structural change might be appropriate, and far from violating James Madison's concerns about mob rule, you say that in fact Madison is centrally concerned about questions of equality and representation that might be well served by a new constitutional convention. Tell us about some of those arguments and your thinking along those lines.
Sure, I will in a minute. My kid's daycare is calling me, so can I just take that real quick?
Of course, this is the most important thing. and
Sorry
friends,
about that.
No, go for it. I'll just tell our friends as you're talking that I would love you to read Jamelle Bouie's columns. They're all in the New York Times. They also have hyperlinks to other sources that he's quoting. So, for example, here I am reading from his column about the need for a constitutional convention, and he quotes James Madison defending himself in no uncertain terms about the concept of political equality. Here he is in 1821 criticizing the views of his younger self. And Madison writes, under every view of the subject, it seems indispensable that the mass of citizens not be without a voice in making the laws which they are to obey and choosing the magistrates who are to administer them. And if the only alternative be between an equal and universal right of suffrage for each branch of government and a confinement of the entire right to part of the citizens, it's better that those having the greater interest at stake, namely that of property and persons both, should be deprived of half their share in government, than that those having the lesser interest, that of personal rights only, should be deprived of the whole. So it's really Madison coming to be sensitized to questions of political equality. And also at this point in his life, around 1821, Madison is worried about income inequality and looking forward to the year 1930, when there's going to be such vast income inequality that he thinks that might threaten democracy. So Jamelle Bouie is really doing something important by resurrecting this strain of Madison's thought that we often miss when we focus only on the young Madison, who's concerned about protecting property rights in the Constitution. Curry, while we're waiting for Jamelle, some questions from our friends?
We do. Gail asked in the very beginning if there were any updates around the status of the John Lewis voting rights bill, and anything from that kind of what is happening around that bill that Jamelle or you could share. The Congress is really at a stalemate right now, and because nothing can pass without filibuster reform, it does not appear that there will be any movement on any financially related bills from Congress. So there's lots to talk about the policy implications of that on both sides, but in practice, those bills are not going anywhere. Jamelle, you're back. I hope everything's okay.
Just a minor injury.
oh, good. Well, that's actually that's a relief. Sending good thoughts for its swift healing. So I was reading from that phenomenal quotation from Madison in 1821, criticizing the views of his younger self and talking about how, as you know, he became more sensitized, as they say, to equality issues later in his career. Tell us about the later Madison and his concern about political equality.
Sure. I mean, so I should say from the outset that one thing I admire about Madison as a political thinker, and it's funny, we typically, when I say we, sort of in the broad sense, kind of the public, we tend to think of Madison as a pair with Jefferson. We think about him more or less in terms of being the father of the Constitution, but he was a practical politician for more of his life, right? Like for the nearly 50 years, no, a little more than 50 years after the Constitution. He was a practical politician for most of that time. And so what's interesting about him is that his beliefs really change, and his views change in relation to him actually being, over the course of that time, a leader in the Congress, a president, a party leader throughout all that time. And so by the time that Madison is kind of post-presidency in the last 2 decades of his life, and in this particular moment, he's preparing his notes on the Constitutional Convention for publication, he has just had a lot of time to think and reflect on what he got right and what he got wrong about his younger self. And the thing I think what Madison does come to believe and embrace, and I think this is very much a consequence of being a practical politician, of organizing people into political activity, is that the kinds of limits on participation, the kinds of barriers between the people and the government that he imagined would be necessary as a younger man. He's sort of learned that they really weren't necessary. That the public, the people, even as circumscribed as they were at the time, mostly just white men, not so much property owning anymore. We're getting to the point where there's something like, universal white male suffrage, but still pretty narrow group of Americans. He's come to find, right, that when organized, when given an opportunity, people are virtuous. They can participate in government. They're not going to ruin things. And so I think he comes to this view that the aim should be to encourage people to participate. Madison is very much someone who thinks political activity is a good thing, and wants to, I think in these years, wants to see more people participate. There's a little bit after that, in the 1830s, 1833, right before he dies, he is engaged in a back and forth with John C. Calhoun, the South Carolina statesman, member of the Congress, senator, Secretary of War, Vice President. He is really kind of a major figure of this era. And Calhoun famously is a skeptic of majoritarian democracy, believes that it will pose a burden to particular interests, like those of slaveholders, but not exclusively those of slaveholders. And so Madison's kind of in a back and forth with Calhoun apropos the nullification crisis. And there's this fascinating letter he writes, Madison writes, where he essentially says that, for all the deficiencies of Republican government, majority rules, mass participation, this is the best worst system, right? This is of all the options, this is the one that's going to be the most fair to the most people. And he makes, I don't have the exact quote, but he makes this statement that I've always been very taken with, where he's like, if you're going to reject majority rule, then you have to have some other kind of despot to rule over you. And it's not going to be something as fair or neutral as majority rule. It's going to be an aristocracy. It's going to be a monarchy. It's going to be something else. Those are your only real alternatives. And I think in that letter, in that exchange with Calhoun, you see someone who, in the last years of his life, you could fairly describe as sort of a Democrat, a lowercase d Democrat, someone who has come to embrace mass political participation in not quite modern sense, but something that would be very familiar to modern readers.
So fascinating, and such a crucial part of Madison's later legacy to resurrect. You note that you're inspired by the political scientist Robert Dahl, who wrote in 1998 that in almost all organizations, there's considerable room for more democracy. If you were to identify some major structural reforms that you think might and should make our Constitution more democratic in the spirit of the later Madison, what might they be?
There are a few things. I mean, the obvious one, right? The big obvious one is the Electoral College is really an anachronism. It sort of doesn't, given how we even think of the president, not as sort of a one particularly important constitutional officer, but someone who in some way embodies the people by way of winning their votes. It doesn't really make much sense to have this mediating institution between the votes and the office itself. And I think that would have a bunch of sort of positive effects down the line in terms of encouraging parties to compete for national majorities. But I think a lot of the work to be done really lies with Congress, which is supposed to be kind of the central institution of our government. In I think recent decades, has really become something of a lesser institution. And I think that trends like extreme partisan gerrymandering, the high cost of elections, all these things sort of have made it less and less representative and further away from the kind of direct representative role it's supposed to have. And so my thought, I have a few thoughts on what can be done to kind of make Congress more democratic and give Congress a more robust rule. One of those things is to expand its size. I don't think this is it's going to fix a ton of problems, but I think 435 members of Congress for a country of 330 million people is too small. Even if it's something like 600 or 700 members, I think it's more appropriate given the size of the country. A friend of mine, Lee Drutman, who is a political scientist and wrote a really terrific book called Breaking the Two-Party Doom Loop, very strongly believes that the country needs more parties, if nothing else, to introduce some unpredictability into elections and to encourage coalition building across, ideological, geographical lines and such. I happen to agree with him, and this isn't necessarily a constitutional change. You can just make the change by law, but it would have the effect of a constitutional change, which would be beginning to dismantle the rules that give us two parties. So that's introducing ranked choice voting, introducing multiple member districts, introducing these features that would encourage the creation of new political parties who could then actually win seats in Congress and offer a kind of a broader sense of representation. This goes kind of back to Madison, right? This sense that over a large geographical area, you can have factions meeting factions, ambition meeting ambition, and this will keep any one side from ever dominating the other. And I think a unappreciated problem with our politics right now is that things are so closely divided along kind of a single axis that both sides can imagine just always winning the whole game, right? You can, if you're a Republican, you can imagine kind of winning an enduring victory that will last for a decade. And I think the same is true for Democrats. And that in its very nature encourages people not to want to find points of cooperation and compromise, because next cycle you might win. So why would you bother? If you don't know from cycle to cycle or from decade to decade the exact configuration of coalitions that's going to govern, I think there's a greater incentive to kind of do things now while you can do them. And I think that's underrated. There's campaign finance stuff that I think is worth doing, not necessarily in capping the amount of money that you can spend, but sort of providing an even floor so that you could have more competition in districts. And I think in terms of Congress, specifically the institution, not just selecting representatives, really bolstering Congress's research ability, bolstering staff capacity, kind of really rebuilding Congress as a policymaking institution is very important, to kind of strengthening it and allowing representatives to better represent the people who elected them.
Wow, that's so helpful to put all those democratic reforms on the table: electoral college reform, ranked choice voting, rethinking single member districts, campaign finance reform, bolstering Congress's research ability, and generally making Congress more responsive. Let me ask you about another set of reforms, and if you think they're needed in the wake of January 6th. You've written about January 6th powerfully. You've approved of resolutions to hold the people who took up arms on January 6th responsible under the section of the 14th Amendment that gives Congress the power to expel any officer who engages in sedition. And some, in the wake of January 6th, have said this vindicates the younger Madison's fear of mobs, and we need to slow down deliberation, especially given social media, to prevent passionate factions or mobs from mobilizing quickly, and in order to restore the speed bumps and roadblocks that Madison thought was important. Do you have any sympathy for those kind of reforms, or are you more on the pro-democracy side?
I think I'm more on that pro-democracy side of things, because the January 6th mob was a literal mob. And so I'm just not sure. And that literal mob wasn't the the product of kind of an excess of democracy, right? It was the product of like straightforward demagoguery. It was the product of an actual like profoundly anti-democratic impulse, like a belief that one cannot lose, and that if one does lose, then the actual election must be illegitimate. And I'm not sure how the kinds of reforms that would slow down deliberation even further, even more than it already is, that would sort of curtail democracy would do much about that. I think that I think you can make a case, right, that if those if something like the Electoral College didn't exist, would Trump have even been elected president, right? That in this way that some of these, the saucer, right, the famous metaphor of hot tea in a saucer, some of those institutions have been much more conducive to the kind of things that we fear than our most democratic institutions. And so in dealing thinking about January 6th and dealing with the fallout, my inclination is less to kind of put limits on democratic activity and more to take seriously the idea that it was an insurrection, that this was an attempt to subvert a presidential election, which, had it been successful, would have been kind of the end of the constitutional system as we understand it. Like once that happens, it's sort of where you're in entirely new territory. And my preference remains to seriously investigate links between the White House and members of Congress, and to expel members of Congress who were found to have a direct hand in it. I think that is not beyond the pale of what you do in this sort of situation. And part of me wonders if one of the reasons I think the political system is having such a hard time dealing with January 6th and its fallout is that it represents a profound attack on the existing political order in a way that no one living has ever really experienced. And so there's no frame of reference for what you do in that situation. And there's I think a temptation to treat it as if it's something you can bury under a rug, but I don't think that it is. And I think the only way to really deal with it is to use Congress's authority, use the authority that the political system has to deal with people who would seek to overturn it. And that means removing them from office. It means kind of barring them from running for office again. That's personally what I think should be done for Trump. I think he should just be barred from running for office again, and going from there.
Fascinating. The NCC has an initiative that we're calling the Guardrails of Democracy, where we're asking thought leaders to identify structural and institutional reforms that might protect the constitutional order. In addition to the pro-democracy reforms, are there other institutional reforms, perhaps involving election integrity or voting rights, which is our main topic today, that you think could avoid future attempts to overturn elections and subvert the democratic order?
So I'm generally in favor of a broad and expansive sense of voting rights, and really in favor of legislation that would discourage states from trying to curtail voting rights, that would protect the exercise of voting rights. I would prefer a constitutional amendment that would basically sort of enshrine in the document that Americans have an affirmative right to vote. I think that in terms of preventing another January 6th, what you're looking for are closing the various loopholes and ambiguities that exist that kind of open space for this sort of thing. And so that would mean, and plenty of scholars have talked about this before, reforming the Electoral Count Act, which kind of governs how we count electoral votes, sort of finding some way. And I admit I haven't given a ton of thought to the mechanism for this, but more or less finding some way to ensure that there cannot be sort of, unilaterally rival slates of electors sent from states against the popular vote in that state, and kind of more or less cutting the vice president out of any real formal role in counting those votes, or at least curtailing their ability to do anything when it comes to counting votes. You want that process to be more or less automatic and not really have any wiggle room there. I would want to see. I think it would be in Congress's power to do this, maybe using the guarantee clause as justification, of essentially kind of clarifying that the state legislatures do not actually have the power to unilaterally change the method by which they allocate electors after the fact, which is something that I think is in the air, but it needs to be kind of shut down very immediately. And I would want to see a major federal investment in sort of updating and modernizing election infrastructure, and making sure that the people who run elections are well compensated and well trained, and have basically the backing of the federal government should they face kind of serious political pressure to subvert the count. Those are the kinds of things I think it would be necessary to prevent a repeat of January 6th. Maybe something worth considering as well is it's very unusual that we have this sort of long period between the election and the new government. And so finding ways to shrink that period, whether that is moving elections one way or another, or whether it simply is sort of like getting rid of it altogether, getting rid of lame duck sessions, basically cutting out the time that you would have to organize something like a January 6th. That's where my head is at. Like, how can we, like, what happened, I think, over those months is the former president and his allies basically searched for any possible way they could to overturn the result. And they ended up finding all these little gaps that no one really thought about. No one really thought they meant anything, right? Like no one ever really thought that the actual electoral vote count process meant anything. It was just a formality. But what they did was introduce the idea that it is a place of political contestation. And so what I think the response needs to be is to remove those spaces from political contestation and really clarify that the time for political contestation ends, when the election ends, and then we abide by the result.
Absolutely fascinating. Reform of the Electoral Count Act. Friends, remember that's the act that was passed after the contested election of 1876 and has led to a lot of confusion, changing the transition period between election and inauguration, federal funding of elections, all powerful suggestions. Now I need to ask, in the spirit of while you were away for a moment, one of our friends asked about the status of the John Lewis Act, and I had to say, look, in practice, nothing that is not a financial bill that can go through reconciliation will pass Congress because of the nature of our polarized politics. And all the reforms you've identified in our great conversation today, both the statutory ones and the constitutional reforms, are unlikely in practice to pass for the same reason. You wrote a great piece where you said in the past, it's been constitutional breaking points that have led to structural reform. The Articles of Confederation failed so badly that Shays' Rebellion was leading to mobs in the streets, and there was no alternative to that sort of structure. Would we need something similar today to see the kind of reforms you're talking about? Are we anywhere near that stage? And what light does your deep reading of history cast on the situation we're in now?
I don't know if I hope that we will not require some sort of basically existential crisis to prompt any serious change. I think right now, part of the reason why there has been no real action on democracy reform through Congress is because of the filibuster, and because at this moment the Democratic Party isn't fully on board with ending the filibuster. But it's not really that hard to imagine a scenario, where instead of 50 Democratic senators winning, you have 52 or 53, and then probably the filibuster is gone. And so I think sort of political, the Democratic Party coalition is moving to a place where I think it's the next time it holds power, it's gonna get rid of the filibuster, and you'll see a greater pressure to do something on this end. But constitutional reform, of course, requires broad consensus, and that kind of consensus it comes rarely. And I suppose that it would, even as much as I hope it wouldn't require a crisis, it probably would require some kind of extraordinary event. And I don't know what that event is. I personally don't think I don't think we're on the trajectory we're on puts us close to that event. But a thing I've come very strongly to believe is that we all discount the chance of strange black swan things happening and having, major impacts on our lives and our politics. And so if you're going to draw a straight line from today, assume that the next 20 years are going to look like the last 20 years, then maybe there's not really going to be any constitutional change. But in truth, we have no idea what's going to happen in the next 20 years. And so it is very possible that something happens in the next 20, 30, 40 years that ends up, reconfiguring our politics or putting pressure to make some sort of serious constitutional change. Put this a little differently. No one in 1921 could have imagined the next 30 years of American life, 30 years that would fundamentally transform this country and the entire world, right? No one in 1921 could have imagined that. So I think people should keep that in mind.
It's a profound point. We can learn so much from history, and yet paradigms change so quickly that it is impossible to predict the future based on the past. And the combination of your optimism that we're not yet in an existential crisis, but your caution that we could be in one without expecting it is well taken indeed. Well, this is the best kind of conversation. It's the one that I'm reluctant to end, but my job is to turn the mic back over to Curry for some questions from our friends. I do want to say, Jamelle Bouie, that it's just an honor to learn from you, and I hope we can continue this conversation on National Constitution Center platforms in the coming years and months, because you're shedding a lot of light. So thank you so much, and back to you, Curry.
Thank you. And Jeff, I couldn't agree as more. This was just unbelievably enlightening. And thank you for playing the game with us of trying to figure out the next 2 to 4 years and what's going to happen in our Constitution. So one question from Mike. Mike wanted to ask you about how you felt about voter ID laws that ensure 18 plus citizens can vote. Kind of what's your perspective on those laws?
Yeah, I have no real problem in theory with voter identification laws, especially if they have provisions for everyone to get an ID. I think it's actually be very useful for all Americans to have some sort of state issued ID, simply for access to, the banking system, those sorts of things. What I have a problem with are voter identification laws that don't make provisions for that kind of thing. As soon as you have a law that allows certain kinds of IDs but not others, then you have a law that effectively puts a burden on some people when they want to vote. And so a voter ID law that comes with universal ID, I would be absolutely for. But anything short of that, I'm or one that has, a broad definition of what counts as ID, but anything short of that, I'm skeptical of. And my apologies for any noise in the background. Stuff happening at my house.
Totally okay. We've all been there. I think one time there was like a bandsaw behind Jeff, so we're good. The kids thought there was a T-Rex with him. One final question, and then we'll let you go. You talked in the beginning, and I absolutely loved it. You talked about like pulling on a string, that your brain pulls on a string, and you keep going with it. And I think that's actually a brilliant thing to encourage in our students, and saying we talk about rabbit holes, going down rabbit holes on a topic, and we get so excited about it. And what I think is fascinating about the work that you do is that you use different genres. And so sometimes kids want to pull strings, but they want to get to that information in a different way. So you have a podcast, you're a writer, but you're also a photographer. Can you talk about how you mix your kind of ways of capturing the moment and capturing history for the next generation?
Sure. I've been, like most people, kind of stuck in one place for the last while. So my photography has kind of gotten very, very narrow during this time. But what I liked, my kind of perspective as a writer, I think, is someone who usually operates from pretty high up in altitude, 10,000 feet, 20,000 feet, 30,000 feet. And I like to use my photography as a way to maybe get a little closer, right? Like I enjoy portraiture. I enjoy sort of like still life stuff, like really focusing on particular objects as a way to get closer and find more detail in the very specific. And in the same way, insofar that influences my writing, it is sort of a reminder for myself to not get too high up there and to always try to bring things back down to the concrete and to the specific, and to discrete things that are happening. I think that one real danger of the kind of opinion writing that I do, that the work, the kind of world that I'm in, is you can very easily just kind of stay at this level of abstraction. So always kind of bringing it back down to sort of like actual institutions, actual people, actual things, is useful. My photography kind of like helps me, is like a thing I do that helps me remember that those things are important. Because as a photographer, big wide pictures of fields are not very interesting. What's interesting is detail. What's interesting is pattern and shape and structure and these sorts of things.
Oh, thank you so much. That was unbelievably helpful. I love the idea of looking at things from the balcony and then grounding yourself with a behavior and a hobby and a skill that allows you to see all different perspectives. And we're always talking about perspectives on the Constitution and how different people come at it. So thank you so much for those useful tools and how our students can do that as well. This has been a great conversation. Thank you so much, Jamelle. Thank you so much, Jeff. Amazing questions. I was nodding like a crazy person over here. And what a great conversation. So again, Jamelle, we'll be asking you back over and over again. So thank you.
Happy to do it. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much. Wonderful conversation. Thanks, friends. See you next week. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.